candle had already burned halfway down by the time anyone noticed how quiet the room had become. Its flame leaned to one side, bent by a draft slipping through the cracks in the trading house shutters, and the wax pooled slowly at its base, thick and uneven, like something that had tried to hold its shape and failed. The ledger lay open beside it, heavy and tired, its leather spine split where too many hands had pressed it flat over too many years. Ink soaked the pages in narrow lines. Names. Numbers. Marks that decided who stayed and who disappeared. Outside, the desert wind scraped along the wooden walls, dragging sand against the boards as if testing their strength. Somewhere beyond the trading post, cattle bells rang in uneven rhythm, metal clinking against metal, a sound so ordinary it had stopped meaning anything at all. Farther still, a church bell rang once then stopped, its echo swallowed by distance. In the spring of 1847 in the New Mexico Territory, this was how life moved forward. Quietly, officially, written down, her name appeared halfway down the page. It was written smaller than the others as if the pen itself had hesitated. Widow. No first name spelled out in full, no family history, just the word pressed into the paper like a final judgment. Beneath it, indented slightly to the right, another entry. Child. The ink there was thinner, the stroke lighter, as though even the ledger did not want to bear the weight of it. There was no surname, no place of origin, only inventory. She stood a few feet from the table, barefoot on the warped floorboards. The wood was cold despite the heat outside, and splinters pressed into her heels where the boards had begun to split. She did not move. Her son stood close against her skirt, his small hands twisted into the fabric, knuckles pale from the pressure. He did not look at the men. He looked at the floor, at the dark stains left by old spills, at the cracks that ran like thin rivers through the planks. His breathing was shallow, almost careful, as if he believed sound itself might betray them. No one addressed her directly. The men gathered around the table spoke in low, even tones, their voices trained by years of negotiation and habit. They talked about routes through the desert that had grown unreliable, about grazing land stripped bare by a winter that came too early and stayed too long, about losses written off as unavoidable. Every sentence carried the weight of reason. Every word sounded practiced. She listened without lifting her head, not because she did not understand, but because she understood too well. These were the sounds that came after a death. First the condolences, thin and brief. Then the questions. Then the numbers. By the time men spoke this calmly, the outcome had already been decided. Widows like her were not considered a tragedy. They were considered residue. What remained once the useful part of a man's life had been buried. Her husband's name had once been written larger in ledgers like this one. He had owned animals, tools, a small piece of land that looked impressive only to those who had never owned anything at all. Then illness took him, slowly enough to drain what little savings they had, quickly enough to leave questions unanswered. The ledger did not record the nights she stayed awake listening to him breathe. It did not record the way his hands shook when he could no longer lift their child. It only recorded what followed. The men around the table shifted their weight. One cleared his throat. Another adjusted his coat. The candle flickered, throwing shadows that stretched and shrank along the walls, turning familiar faces into shapes that looked briefly unfamiliar. Someone reached out and traced a finger down the page, stopping at her entry. A pause settled over the room. Not a dramatic pause, just a practical one. The kind that happened before a decision moved from ink to action. Then the door opened. It creaked on its hinges, the sound cutting through the low murmur like a blade. Dust followed the man inside, drifting in around his boots, clinging to the hem of his coat. He removed his hat without thinking, holding it against his chest as if he had walked into a church instead of a trading house. His coat was worn thin at the elbows, darkened by sweat and sun. He smelled of horses, of leather, of open land baked dry under a sky that never apologized. He took one step, then stopped. His eyes moved around the room, taking in the men, the table, the ledger. Then they fell on the woman, on the child pressed against her. Something in his posture changed, not dramatically, just enough to be noticed. His shoulders lowered, his grip on the hat tightened. For a moment no one spoke. Even the men at the table seemed uncertain how to continue, as if the presence of someone unaccounted for in the ledger had disrupted the order of things. The candle's flame steadied, standing straight for the first time in minutes, and the room felt as though it were holding its breath. The auctioneer cleared his throat. He was a thin man with ink-stained fingers and a voice that carried easily when he needed it to. He glanced at the cowboy, then back at the ledger as if checking to see whether the interruption had somehow rewritten the page. It had not. He named the price. It was spoken plainly, No flourish, no attempt to soften the sound of it. The number hung in the air, heavy and final. The woman felt it settle in her chest, not as shock but as confirmation. This was how it would happen. The child's fingers tightened in her skirt, pulling the fabric until she felt it strain. The cowboy did not look at the ledger. He did not look at the auctioneer. He looked at the child. It was not a long look, not the kind that demanded attention, just a steady one, observant, the way someone looks when they are trying to understand something without touching it. The child glanced up, startled, then quickly looked away, as if afraid he had done something wrong. The cowboy did not follow the movement. His eyes stayed where they were, fixed on the small figure pressed against the woman's leg. The auctioneer lifted the hammer. This was the moment when most men decided whether they were involved or not, when silence became consent. The woman counted her breaths. 1, 2, she thought of nothing in particular, thinking it never changed outcomes like this. The hammer hovered. Somewhere outside, a gust of wind rattled the shutters again, harder this time. The candle flame bent. Wax spilled over the edge of its holder and ran down the side in a slow, uneven line. The ledger's page rustled as if trying to turn itself. The cowboy shifted his weight. The floorboard beneath his boot creaked, sharp in the stillness. Several heads turned. The auctioneer paused, irritation flickering briefly across his face. The cowboy spoke. His voice was low, almost too low for the room. He did not raise it. He did not announce himself. He simply named a number. It was higher than the last. The auctioneer blinked. He glanced at the ledger, then at the men around the table, as if confirming what he had heard. A murmur rippled through the room. The woman felt it more than she heard it, a change in the air, a tightening. Her heart began to pound, not with hope but with fear sharpened into something more precise. A higher price did not mean mercy, it meant interest. The cowboy did not look at her. He did not look at the men. His eyes remained on the child, steady and unreadable. The auctioneer nodded once. He raised the hammer again. In the narrow space between that motion and what would follow, something unseen shifted. Not in the ledger, not in the law, but in the quiet place where intention lived, unnamed and unrecorded. The woman did not know it yet. No one in the room did. But later, when the dust had settled and the candle had burned itself into a stub, people would remember this moment differently. They would say the air felt heavier, or that the room had grown colder, or that the silence lasted too long. What they would not say, what the ledger would never record, was that for the first time since her husband's death, someone had looked past the ink and seen what it was trying so carefully to erase. No one ever asked how a widow came to be sold, because in those years the answer was considered too simple to deserve a question. A husband gone, a debt unpaid, a system that mistook necessity for justice and called it order. Her husband's name had once carried weight in the town, written clearly on receipts and agreements, spoken with a nod of respect at the trading post. He had been known as a man who paid what he owed, who kept his fences mended, who showed up when called. Then the sickness came, quiet at first, then relentless. It arrived without ceremony and stayed long enough to empty their cupboards and their savings. By the time mercy might have mattered, it was already too late. The town remembered his death as an inconvenience. She remembered it as a sound, the way his breathing changed in the dark, the way silence settled afterward and never quite left. After the funeral, the visits began. Men came to her door carrying ledgers instead of casseroles. They removed their hats and spoke gently, as if kindness could soften arithmetic. They sat at her table, their boots tracking dust across the floor she had scrubbed that morning, and drank her weak coffee without complaint. They spoke about obligations, about patience, about how unfortunate it all was. They said her husband would have understood. They said they were only doing their duty. When she told them she could not pay, they nodded slowly, as if she had finally said the thing they had been waiting to hear. Their disappointment never reached their eyes. They closed their ledgers carefully, stood, and thanked her for her time. Each visit ended the same way, with the soft scrape of chairs and the quiet certainty that something had shifted against her, unseen but permanent. In town, people whispered, though never when she was close enough to answer. They whispered that she should have remarried sooner, as if grief were a failure of planning. They whispered that a woman alone was an error the world eventually corrected, one way or another. They whispered that survival was not a right but a negotiation. No one whispered about the child. No one spoke of how he slept with his shoes on, afraid that if he took them off he might be told to leave before morning. No one noticed how he stopped asking where his father went at night, as if he had learned that some questions only made the dark heavier. The town moved around them with practiced indifference. The preacher nodded solemnly when he passed her on the street, his eyes already sliding away. The shopkeeper weighed her goods carefully, exact to the ounce, no longer rounding down as he once had. The clerk who had borrowed sugar from her kitchen the year before now spoke to her only through the counter, his words clipped, his gaze fixed on the register. The trading house was not cruel in the way stories like to remember cruelty. It did not shout, it did not strike, it did not gloat. It was orderly, efficient, its floors were swept, its books were balanced. The men who worked there believed themselves moral because they followed rules written long before her grief existed. They believed order itself was a virtue and that anything preserved by order must therefore be right. They never spoke of choice. They spoke only of process. When her name appeared in the ledger, it was not treated as a decision but as a conclusion, something inevitable, something already settled. On the day she was brought there, she walked past faces she recognized, faces that recognized her in return and then looked away. The air inside the building smelled of dust and oil and old paper. It smelled like permanence. When the bidding began, she did not cry. Crying, she had learned, only entertained them. Tears made men uncomfortable, and discomfort was the one thing the process did not allow. Instead, she stared at the floor and counted the cracks in the wood. One near her left foot branched into 3 smaller lines. Another ran straight toward the wall and vanished beneath it. She promised herself she would remember them all, every detail, every sound, every breath. Proof that this moment was real and not something her mind had invented to survive. Around her, voices rose and fell in careful rhythm. Numbers were exchanged like greetings. The child pressed closer to her, his presence a steady weight against her leg. She did not look down. Looking down might have undone her. She kept her eyes fixed on the floor and listened to the room decide her future without ever speaking her name. And still, no one intervened. Not the preacher who had buried her husband and spoken of mercy with practiced ease. Not the clerk who had once laughed in her kitchen while measuring sugar into a borrowed cup. Not the men who shifted uncomfortably and told themselves there was nothing they could do. Silence filled the spaces where resistance might have lived. It sat heavy and complete, asking nothing and offering nothing in return. History often hides its violence in procedure. It disguises harm as routine and calls it necessary. It teaches people that if enough hands touch an act, no single hand can be blamed. The widow felt this truth settle over her like dust, fine and inescapable. She understood then that what was happening was not considered wrong. It was considered resolved. When the auctioneer spoke, his voice carried no malice, only habit. When the hammer lifted, it did so without hesitation. The room had performed this ritual too many times to falter now. The child's fingers tightened again, and she felt the fabric of her skirt pull, a small, desperate reminder that something living still depended on her. She wondered briefly if anyone would remember this moment years from now, or if it would dissolve into the pages of the ledger reduced to ink and numbers and the quiet satisfaction of order maintained. Outside, the town continued its day. Doors opened and closed. Wagons rolled past. Somewhere someone laughed. The world did not pause for injustice. It rarely ever had. And as the silence held, as the process continued exactly as designed, the truth settled in with unbearable clarity. It was not cruelty that had brought her here. It was compliance. And silence like ink lasts longer than blood. The cowboy's voice entered the room the way dust entered through the shutters, quietly and without asking permission, almost lost beneath the rustle of paper and the low murmur of men who believed the matter was already settled. He did not lift his hand like the others had. He did not clear his throat or look around for approval. He simply spoke a number, calm and steady, as if he were reading it from memory rather than inventing it in that moment. Then he added words that did not belong in that room, words that felt foreign among ledgers and balances, words that made the air hesitate. He said he would take responsibility for both. For a brief moment, no one reacted. The auctioneer blinked, uncertain whether he had heard correctly because responsibility was not a legal term. Ownership was, transfer was, sale was. The ledger on the table had no column for intent, no space for conscience, no line that could contain a promise. The candle flame wavered as if unsure which way to lean, and the room shifted in a way that could not be measured. The men exchanged glances, quick and restrained. This was not how transactions were meant to unfold. The auctioneer hesitated, his fingers tightening around the hammer, his eyes moving from the cowboy to the ledger and back again, searching for guidance in ink. The rules were clear, but the moment was not. He cleared his throat and repeated the number, slower this time, testing it against the silence. No one countered. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable, filled with the weight of something unnamed. Finally, the hammer came down, not with triumph but with reluctance, as if it understood it had just sealed something it could not fully define. The woman did not move. She felt the sound travel through the floorboards and into her feet, a dull vibration that marked the end of one life and the uncertain beginning of another. Her hands trembled, but she kept them still, afraid that any movement might unravel what had just occurred. The child looked up at her, searching her face for a signal she did not yet have. Behind the trading floor, in a small office that smelled of old paper and stale ink, a contract was drawn. The room was narrow, its single window coated with dust, letting in light that felt filtered and distant. The clerk wrote carefully, his pen scratching softly, pausing now and then as if waiting for the words themselves to object. The language was precise, stripped of emotion, designed to reduce complexity into something manageable. The woman was handed the paper. Her name was written there, spelled correctly for the first time in months. Her hand shook as she took the pen. The ink bled slightly where she pressed too hard, a dark bloom that marked her consent. She signed because she had learned that refusal was not an option afforded to people like her. The cowboy stood a few steps away, hat pressed against his chest, his eyes lowered, his posture still. He did not rush her. He did not speak. He waited as if standing before a grave, understanding that some moments required quiet rather than reassurance. When the clerk finished, he folded the paper and set it aside, nodding once as if completing a task rather than witnessing a turning point. Outside, the desert waited. When they stepped back into the light, the heat wrapped around them, immediate and unforgiving. The trading house door closed behind them with a sound that felt final, the latch settling into place as if sealing a chapter of history. The woman stood still for a moment, blinking against the brightness, her senses overwhelmed by the sudden openness. The child clung to her hand, his grip tight, his eyes darting around as if expecting someone to call them back. No one did. The cowboy adjusted his hat and turned away from the building, his boots leaving shallow impressions in the dirt. She followed, not because she trusted him, but because there was nowhere else to go. They walked in silence at first, the space between them filled with the sounds of the desert wind moving through dry brush, insects humming unseen. It was only after the trading house had disappeared behind them, only after the noise of commerce had been swallowed by distance, that he spoke again. He did not look at her when he did. His eyes were fixed on the horizon, on a line where the land seemed to dissolve into sky. He said he had lost a family once. The words were simple, offered without embellishment. He said he had learned what it cost to let the world decide who mattered. There was no sermon in his voice, no attempt to persuade or comfort. It sounded like a statement written after too many nights alone, revised until nothing unnecessary remained. She listened, her mind struggling to place the sound of his voice against everything she had just endured. He did not speak of ownership. He did not speak of what he was owed. He spoke only of responsibility, as if it were a burden willingly taken rather than imposed. He told her he could not undo what had been done, could not fix the law or the world that had brought her to that room. He could only decide what he would not repeat. He promised not possession but presence. Not control but protection. The words settled between them, tentative and fragile, like something that might break if examined too closely. She did not answer. She did not know how. Trust, she had learned, was a luxury that came after survival, not before it. As they walked, she studied him in small, careful glances. The lines around his eyes suggested years spent squinting into sun and distance. His hands were rough, scarred in places, marked by work rather than violence. He walked at a pace that matched hers without comment, slowing when the child struggled, adjusting without drawing attention to it. Nothing about him felt urgent. Nothing felt rehearsed. That unsettled her more than cruelty ever had. In the days that followed, she waited for the promise to unravel. She waited for conditions to emerge, for kindness to transform into expectation. She waited for the familiar tightening in her chest that came when gratitude was demanded as payment. It did not come. He gave them space. He gave them food without ceremony. He spoke when necessary and listened when it mattered. The child began to sleep without his shoes on. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the nights grew quieter. Years later, long after the dust of that day had settled, a letter would surface. It was found folded among old papers never sent, its edges worn thin by handling. It was written in his hand, careful and restrained, addressed to no one in particular. In it he stated plainly that he never believed the law was right. He wrote that he had followed it only because refusing it outright would have changed nothing. He wrote that the world taught children fear early, and that he had seen what happened when fear became their first language. He did not frame his actions as heroism. He did not ask for understanding. He simply wrote what he believed should not have happened, and what he chose to prevent, even if only once. The letter ended without a signature, as if the words themselves were enough. Truth does not always arrive with thunder. It does not always announce itself or demand recognition. Sometimes it arrives quietly, in the form of a promise made without witnesses and kept without reward. Sometimes it lives not in laws or ledgers, but in the steady refusal to let silence have the final word. The trading house did not fall all at once. It sagged first slowly year by year, as if the land itself were growing tired of holding it upright. After the war, when roots shifted and towns forgot what had once seemed permanent, its roof began to leak. Wind slipped through broken boards and carried sand inside, coating the counters and ledgers alike. One winter a beam cracked. Another season a wall leaned outward just enough to be noticed. Eventually no one came to repair it. The doors hung open. The ledgers were left behind, their pages curling as the sun bleached the ink. Rain blurred names that had once decided lives. Dust filled the spaces where authority had lived. The building collapsed quietly without witnesses, its remains sinking back into the ground as if the desert were reclaiming a mistake. But the homestead endured. It stood farther from town, closer to the open land where the horizon stretched without interruption. People spoke of it differently, not as a place of charity, not as a story meant to inspire. They spoke of it as a place of order, a place where voices were low and steady, where a man never raised his hand or his voice, and where a woman who had once learned silence as survival slowly learned speech again. No one called it remarkable. It simply existed season after season, unchanged by gossip. The child grew there. At first he was careful in everything he did, as if waiting for correction. He learned to ride with his eyes fixed forward, his small body stiff until the rhythm of the horse finally taught him balance. He learned to read at the table in the evenings, tracing letters with a finger before daring to speak them aloud. He practiced signing his name on scraps of paper, copying it again and again until the letters no longer shook. No one hurried him. No one reminded him of what he had once been worth to the world. He did not inherit land written neatly in records. He did not inherit titles or favors owed. What he inherited was quieter and heavier. He inherited the knowledge that when his name had meant nothing, when he had been counted only as an attachment, someone had chosen him anyway. That knowledge shaped him more than property ever could. The woman changed too, though fewer people noticed. At first she spoke little, her sentences short, her eyes always measuring the room. Over time her voice steadied. She began to look people in the eye when she spoke. She made decisions without apology. She learned the shape of days that did not end in fear. Her name was spoken again, not often but without hesitation. It never returned to the books that had erased it, but it returned to use, to memory, to the small rituals of daily life that do not require permission. Years passed, seasons stacked upon one another. The war ended. New families arrived, old ones disappeared. The trading house became a story told vaguely, its details blurred, its cruelty softened by time. Few remembered exactly what it had done. Fewer cared. Then decades later, a schoolteacher working through county records found an old ledger while cataloging documents thought to be worthless. The book was heavy and brittle, its cover cracked, its pages stuck together in places where moisture had once seeped in. She opened it carefully, brushing away dust. Names stared back at her, many crossed out, some smudged beyond recognition. She turned page after page, noting dates, transfers, sales concluded in tidy columns. Then she saw it. A woman listed as a widow. Beneath it, a child. She read the page twice, then again more slowly. She searched for the conclusion, for the next line that should have followed. There was none. No transfer recorded, no sale completed, just an absence where finality should have been. In the margin, written smaller than the rest, someone had added a single line, refused the usual terms. The teacher paused. She sat back and closed the ledger, the room around her quiet except for the ticking of a clock. The phrase stayed with her. It did not explain itself. It did not assign blame. It simply existed, a crack in the certainty of the record. She reopened the book and traced the words with her eyes, imagining the hand that had written them. Perhaps the clerk, uncertain. Perhaps the auctioneer, defensive. Perhaps someone who had known the difference between law and justice and lacked the language to reconcile them. History often records what people did. It rarely records why. The teacher understood that what she was holding was not an answer but an opening. She wrote a note in her own careful script and placed it in the file, unsure whether anyone would ever read it. Outside, the town moved on, unaware that anything had been unsettled. The cowboy's grave lay on a rise overlooking the land, marked only by a simple stone. No name, no dates, no epitaph. Those who knew him said he would have preferred it that way. The widow was buried elsewhere, her resting place tended quietly by those who remembered her not as a story but as a presence. Her name never returned to the books. It remained lost to official memory, yet the desert remembered footsteps more faithfully than paper ever could. It remembered the path from the homestead to the well, worn smooth by years of use. It remembered the tracks of a child learning to walk without fear. It remembered a man who paused when the world expected him to proceed. Wind passed over the land, erasing and reshaping, carrying grains of sand from one place to another, mixing what had been separate. Somewhere between what was written and what was lived, the truth waited. Not loud, not demanding, just present. Waiting for someone willing to notice the absence, to ask why a record ended too soon. Some names never return to ledgers. Some stories survive only in the spaces between lines. And sometimes, long after the buildings have fallen and the ink has faded, history still leans close and whispers what it could not say aloud at the time. That power can be interrupted. That cruelty can be refused. That some names only find peace when the truth is told.